Cora Langston stood alone by the porch rail, boots dusty, arms crossed tight against a chill she would never admit to feeling. The sun dipped low, throwing long golden spears across the open fields where the cattle once roamed fat and easy. Now the pasture was thin and the fences sagged like old shoulders. Inside, the floorboards creaked beneath lighter feet. Maybelle's voice, sweet and fragile as spun glass, carried through the open window, humming some song about rivers and lost time. It was an old tune, learned from their mother's lips, back when the world still seemed like a kind place. Maybelle didn't sing much these days, but when she did, it stitched a kind of aching hope into the heavy air. Rachel was at the barn, oiling the hinges of the big double doors. She worked with her head low, dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense braid. She was the youngest, but folks said she had more grit than men twice her age. Her hands, nicked and scarred from years of hard work, moved with purpose. She understood better than anyone that wood needed tending just like animals, or else it would give up and rot. It had been 6 months since their father had taken that bad fall rounding up a stray Mustang. 6 months since the Langston sisters became the last defense against a world that didn't much care if they sank or swam. They were an oddity, a curiosity, sometimes even a joke among the men at the saloon who thought a ranch was no place for women. The sheriff had stopped by once or twice, offering help too steeped in pity to be accepted. Even their neighbors had grown distant, wary of the rumors that the Langston place was cursed. Still, they had held on, if only by the fingernails. Cora's gaze traveled over the land. She had memorized every inch of it by now. The leaning cottonwood at the edge of the west pasture, the dip in the ridge where deer would bed down at dusk, the line of the creek flashing silver in the afternoon light. This land was not just dirt and grass. It was memory. It was the smell of her mother's bread cooling on the windowsill. It was the warm rasp of her father's voice as he taught her how to mend a fence. It was every scraped knee, every secret whispered beneath the stars. And it was slipping through their fingers. The bank agent had come last week, hat in hand but words sharp as barbed wire. Taxes unpaid. Deadlines passed. Without help, the ranch would be sold off to the highest bidder by winter. Help, of course, was not easy to come by. Hiring ranch hands cost more than they could afford. Relatives were either too far away or too dead to matter. And trusting the men in town felt like handing over a lamb to a pack of wolves. Which left only one desperate, foolish plan. Cora pulled the letter from her pocket for the 10th time that day. The paper was creased and softened from handling. The ink faded slightly by the sweat of her palm. The advertisement had been printed in a battered gazette from back east, promising strong, able men seeking frontier wives. Some would say it was scandalous. Others would call it survival. Inside, Maybelle's humming stilled. The door creaked open and she stepped out, wrapping a shawl tight around her shoulders. Her cheeks were pink from the firelight, her blue eyes large and full of unspoken questions. "Did you send it?" she asked softly, as if louder words might break something between them. Cora nodded. "I sent it." A beat of silence stretched between them, filled only by the sighing wind. "I don't like the idea," Maybelle said, twisting the fringe of her shawl between nervous fingers. "Marrying strangers." "We're not marrying anyone," Cora said, though her voice lacked its usual iron. "Not really. It's just arrangements. Agreements. Help in exchange for a share of the land." Rachel joined them then, wiping her hands on a rag, her dark brows drawn together in a frown. "And what if they're worse than the trouble already breathing down our necks?" Cora folded the letter back into her pocket with care, as if it were something fragile. "We choose carefully. We set terms. We keep our eyes open." Rachel's frown deepened, but she said no more. There were no good choices left, only ones that bought them a little more time. The sun slipped below the horizon, bleeding the last of its color across the sky. A chill settled over the ranch, wrapping around the three sisters like a second skin. In the growing dark, the house behind them looked less like a home and more like a battered ship about to sink beneath unseen waves. They turned in together, the way they always had, moving through the nightly rituals of locking doors, checking windows, banking the fire. There was comfort in the small routines, in the way Rachel tapped each window latch twice, the way Maybelle tucked a sprig of dried sage above the hearth for luck. Cora moved from room to room, lantern in hand, feeling the weight of her sisters' lives pressing into her ribs. Later, as the house settled into its creaks and sighs, Cora sat alone at the kitchen table. A single candle burned low, pooling wax like spilled milk. She traced circles on the tabletop with the tip of her finger, lost in thought. She wondered what kind of men would answer the call. She wondered if hope could be stitched back into the torn fabric of their lives, or if this choice would tear them further apart. She wondered if love had any place left in hearts already so battered by loss and fear. Across the table, the empty chairs sat like silent sentinels. Her father's old hat still hung on its peg by the door, untouched since the day he had worn it last. For a moment, the ache rose so sharply in her chest that she pressed her fist against it, as if she could hold the broken pieces together by sheer will. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the windows, stirring the prairie grasses into a restless dance. It smelled of change. It smelled of endings. And yet, somewhere deep beneath the sorrow, a stubborn root of hope remained. Thin, perhaps. Fragile. But alive. The morning brought a rare kind of stillness, the kind that precedes something important. The sisters moved through their chores with a sense of quiet anticipation, casting glances toward the dusty road that led from town. Every creak of saddle leather, every distant hoofbeat set their hearts leaping into their throats. It was Maybelle who spotted the first rider. She was out by the chicken coop, scattering feed, when she straightened suddenly, one hand shielding her eyes. "Cora," she called, voice high and uncertain. "Someone's coming." Cora stepped onto the porch, Rachel at her heels. 3 figures rode slowly toward them, their outlines shimmering in the heat rising from the ground. Strangers, yes, but perhaps, just perhaps, not enemies. They watched as the riders drew closer. 3 men, each different from the other. The first rode tall and straight, his hat tipped back to reveal a sharp, smiling face. His clothes were fine, too fine for a working man. Something about his easy posture prickled unease along Cora's spine. The second slouched in his saddle, movements lazy, a cigarette dangling from his lips. His horse looked poorly kept, his boots scuffed to ruin. Maybelle's hands twisted the fabric of her apron in nervous knots. The third rode quietly, a little apart from the others. His horse was sturdy, his gear plain but well cared for. His face was harder to read, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. But there was something in the way he sat, solid and steady, that caught Rachel's sharp gaze. The sisters stood together, a line of defense against the unknown. As the men swung down from their horses, dust rising around their boots, the air seemed to hold its breath. Names were exchanged, hands shaken. Boone Reddick, Clay Maddox, Joseph Cole. Cora's voice was calm, even welcoming, but her heart was a sparrow beating itself against her ribs. She could not know, not yet, that betrayal had already crossed her threshold. Nor could she know that somewhere among these strangers walked a man who would stand with her not because he was paid to, but because he chose to. The wind stirred again, lifting the hem of her skirt, brushing cool fingers against the nape of her neck. It smelled of rain. It smelled of reckoning. And the sisters, though wary, did not turn away. They had chosen hope. Now, hope would choose them back, or destroy them trying. The first night the strangers slept under the Langston roof, the house breathed differently. It seemed to exhale a deeper, slower sound, as if adjusting to the new weight of foreign footsteps crossing its worn floors. The girls moved through the narrow hallways with cautious steps, their voices dropping low without them realizing. Even the horses in the barn seemed to stamp and snort more than usual, uneasy with the scent of change. Boone Reddick took quickly to the front room, sprawling across their father's old armchair as though he had been born to it. His boots scuffed the wood, and when he laughed, it was too loud, echoing against walls that remembered softer men. His smile dazzled in the firelight, white and sharp, but his eyes were quick to narrow when no one was looking. Cora watched him from across the room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, hiding the way her fingers itched to scrub that chair clean. Clay Maddox was a quieter sort, but not in the way that brought peace. He moved with a slouching grace, a snake sliding through tall grass, and his glances toward Maybelle lingered a beat too long. He smelled of whiskey even in the early morning, and had a laugh that never reached his tired, bitter eyes. When he spoke, it was with words thick as molasses, a charm worn thin by too many promises broken too many times. Joseph Cole said little at all. He sat straight-backed at the farthest end of the kitchen table, his hat held respectfully in his lap. His boots were clean, his coat patched but cared for, and his presence was like a low, steady drumbeat that neither clashed nor harmonized with the sisters' uneasy melodies. He spoke only when spoken to, and even then, with words measured and plain. Rachel noticed the way he fixed the barn door without being asked, the way he soothed the nervous roan gelding with slow, sure hands. That first evening, supper stretched long and taut, each clang of fork against plate a small jolt against nerves already worn thin. Boone did most of the talking, spinning tales of cattle drives and bar fights, of gold strikes and gun duels, painting himself larger than life with each passing minute. Cora smiled where politeness demanded but said little, preferring to weigh the truth of a man by the quiet between his boasts. Clay asked Maybelle to sing after the dishes were cleared. His voice was sweet when he said it, sugar melting into the rough edges of his drawl. Maybelle shook her head shyly, cheeks coloring, but Clay pressed with a wink and a playful nudge that made her flinch, though she tried to hide it. The fire popped loudly in the silence that followed, and Rachel's hand found Maybelle's beneath the table, squeezing gently. Joseph did not join in the coaxing. Instead, he busied himself stacking the dishes, moving with a careful economy of motion that spoke louder than Boone's tall tales or Clay's lazy smiles. Rachel watched him, the way a hawk watches a rabbit not from hunger, but out of sharpened curiosity. When the evening wore down and the men took up places in the bunkhouse out back, the sisters gathered at the hearth, where the embers glowed like the last stubborn heartbeats of the day. They spoke little. There was too much to say, and too much fear that saying it aloud would make it real. Cora stared into the fire until her vision blurred, the muscles of her jaw tight with unspoken thoughts. Maybelle tucked her legs beneath her on the worn sofa, hands fidgeting in her lap, her usual singing voice silent. Rachel paced a slow, restless circle around the room, her boots whispering against the floorboards. "They're not what I pictured," Maybelle said finally, her voice a hush against the crackle of burning wood. "No," Cora agreed, her voice a dry scrape. "They're not. Joseph ain't like the other two," Rachel said. Her tone held no warmth, only observation. "But I still don't trust him. Trust ain't free." "No," Cora said again. Her heart weighed heavy against her ribs, but she tucked the feeling away. They had made their bed. Now they would lie in it, for better or worse. Morning came crisp and bright, the frost painting delicate white lace across the fields. Work waited for no one, least of all women trying to run a ranch on promises and prayers. The men pitched in, as agreed, though the quality of their help varied wildly. Boone rode out with Cora to mend the north fence, talking all the while about plans to expand the herd, to invest in better stock, to build a bigger barn. His words hung in the air, grand and empty, and when he slipped a hand to her waist as they climbed through a broken rail, Cora stiffened so hard her bones ached. Boone laughed it off, a tease, a joke, but Cora saw the way his mouth tightened when she pulled away. Clay stayed close to Maybelle, offering to help with the chickens, the garden, the small repairs around the house. His help came with a price. The way he stood too near, the way his hand brushed her shoulder too casually, too often. Maybelle smiled through it, polite and frightened all at once, her light dimming with every unwanted touch she dared not call out. Joseph took to the harder tasks without complaint. He repaired the western pasture gate, cleared the clogged irrigation ditch, mucked the stables. He never asked where he was needed. He simply found the work and did it. Rachel kept half an eye on him, suspicious still, but grudgingly respectful. When he found her wrestling with a jammed plow blade, he said nothing, simply stepped forward, lent his strength to hers, and stepped away again without so much as a word of praise or expectation. At night, the hearth was no longer their own. Boone dominated the space, his boots up on the table, his voice booming. Clay nursed a flask tucked into his vest, growing surlier with each sip. Joseph remained a shadow on the edges, present but unobtrusive, a figure Rachel sometimes caught studying the room with an expression too heavy to name. The sisters met in whispered conferences after the house quieted, fear threading their voices. "I don't like it," Maybelle said one night, her hands twisting the hem of her nightdress. "I don't like the way they look at us." "They think they own a piece of us now," Rachel said bitterly. That's the bargain they think they struck. We made no promises like that, Cora said, but the words felt brittle on her tongue. We agreed to work together. That's all. But they don't see it that way, Maybelle said, and her eyes shone with unshed tears. We hold the line, Cora said, reaching out to grasp her sister's hands in hers. No matter what comes, we hold the line. Still, an unease grew like mold in the corners of the house. Boone's jokes grew sharper. Clay's hands lingered longer. Joseph grew more withdrawn, his silences heavier. It was not a matter of if something would break, but when. One afternoon, as the sisters prepared supper, a voice cut through the thin walls of the kitchen. Boone and Clay, speaking in low, urgent tones out by the barn. Rachel stilled, a dish slipping half-washed from her hands into the basin. "Did you hear?" she started. Cora nodded, wiping her hands dry. "Stay here." But Rachel followed, silent as a hunting cat, her steps light and quick. They pressed themselves against the barn wall, listening to the muffled words carried by the wind. "Easy pickings," Boone was saying. "3 girls, a ranch near worthless, no men to stand for them. We take it, we sell it, we ride out richer than we ever dreamed." Clay's laugh was low and ugly. "And if they don't play nice?" Boone's answer was a sound, not a word, a sharp, cruel snort that made Rachel's stomach twist. She backed away, careful and slow, her heart pounding against her ribs. Cora caught her wrist, grounding her. They returned to the house without a word between them, but the air around them pulsed with understanding. The strangers at their hearth were not saviors. They were wolves. And the sisters were the lambs left to fend for themselves. Still, in the darkest corner of the gathering night, there was a flicker of something else, of a gaze steady and sorrowful, watching the sisters not with hunger, but with regret. Joseph Cole sat apart, a man divided, his loyalty a storm he had not yet chosen to weather. The sisters would not break easily. They were Langstons, daughters of the hard soil and harder seasons. But the battle for Willow Creek had already begun, and not all hearts would survive it untouched. Outside, the prairie wind rose again, carrying the scent of dust and the warning of storms yet to come. The blood moon rose heavy over Willow Creek, a red and watchful eye swelling in the velvet dark. It cast a strange light over the land, making the familiar strange, turning the dusty fields to seas of rust and shadow. The sisters worked late that evening, drawn into small, quiet chores, their hands busy to silence the clamor building in their chests. The men were restless too, their movements sharp-edged, their voices cutting through the cooling air like blades against stone. Cora tightened the latch on the chicken coop, her fingers numb against the splintered wood. Across the yard, Boone leaned against the fence, rolling a cigarette between calloused fingers. He watched her openly, unashamed, a lazy smirk playing on his lips. Cora stiffened under his gaze, refusing to let him see the tremor in her hands. Inside the house, Maybelle folded linens with slow, distracted movements. Clay lounged nearby, tossing a knife end over end, catching it with a snap of his wrist each time. The blade flashed in the low lamplight, a wicked glint that made Maybelle's skin crawl. She kept her eyes on her task, her heart thudding like a frightened bird against the hollow of her throat. Rachel sat by the hearth, pretending to mend a bridle strap while her eyes flicked to the door, the windows, the gun tucked behind the flour barrel. Joseph was outside, repairing a broken hinge on the stable, but she could feel his absence keenly, like a missing tooth one cannot help but prod with a tongue. He was the only one who looked at them without weighing the worth of their skin or their land. And yet, trust was a brittle thing, easily shattered, and Rachel had not survived this long by handing it out like bread at a wake. The sisters had not spoken aloud the truth they each knew now, but it lived between them, thick and undeniable. The men had not come to build a life beside them. They had come to take it. Night deepened. The moon climbed higher, bleeding its color across the wide prairie sky. A cool wind stirred the dust, lifting it into ghostly tendrils that danced and curled along the ground. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its voice thin and broken. Boone and Clay disappeared into the dark together, heads bent close, their laughter low and mean. The sound pricked Cora's spine like a thorn. She found Rachel's gaze across the yard, and a silent conversation passed between them. It was time. They gathered in the kitchen, their words quick and soft. "They're moving tonight," Rachel said, her voice grim. Cora nodded. "We have to be ready." Maybelle wrung her hands. "We can't fight them. Not just us." "We're not alone," Cora said, glancing toward the window where the stable light still flickered. "Not entirely." It was a risk, trusting Joseph. But then, so was everything else. Rachel slipped outside, her movements quiet as shadow. She found Joseph in the barn, tightening the latch on the feed door. He straightened when he saw her, his face unreadable in the dim light. "They're planning something," she said, her voice low. "Tonight." Joseph wiped his hands on a rag, staring at her for a long moment. "I know," he said finally. Rachel's breath caught, more from relief than surprise. She stepped closer, searching his face for some sign of deceit. She found none, only a tired sorrow that mirrored her own. "Will you help us?" she asked. Joseph looked past her toward the house, toward the faint glow of lamplight at the windows, the fragile promise of home trembling against the dark. He tipped his hat back slightly, exposing eyes the color of storm clouds. "Yes," he said simply. A knot loosened inside Rachel's chest. She gave a sharp nod and slipped back into the night. In the house, the sisters armed themselves as best they could. A rifle with a cracked stock, a handful of cartridges, a rusted revolver tucked into Cora's belt. Maybelle carried a kitchen knife wrapped in cloth to steady her shaking hand. The waiting stretched thin and painful, each minute a taut wire straining toward the inevitable break. It came just after midnight. The crash of the front door splintering inward shattered the fragile peace. Boone stormed through first, wild-eyed, his face twisted into something unrecognizable. Clay followed close behind, brandishing a shotgun, his mouth curled into a snarl. Cora raised the rifle, her hands steady. Boone laughed, the sound jagged. "You ain't gonna shoot me, sweetheart," he said, stepping closer. "Ain't in your nature." Behind him, Clay edged toward Maybelle, who shrank back, the knife trembling in her grasp. Joseph moved then, silent and swift. He tackled Clay, the two of them crashing to the floor in a tangle of limbs and curses. The shotgun clattered away, sliding under the table. Boone lunged at Cora, grabbing the barrel of her rifle, wrenching it aside. They struggled, boots scraping against the floor, the smell of sweat and rage thick between them. Boone was stronger, but Cora fought with the desperation of a woman with nothing left to lose. Maybelle darted forward, grabbing the shotgun and swinging it up with surprising force. The butt of the gun struck Boone's shoulder, staggering him just long enough for Cora to rip free. Joseph pinned Clay against the floor, wrenching a knife from the other man's belt and tossing it aside. His face was grim, his movements precise. He fought not like a man chasing glory, but like one defending something sacred. Rachel grabbed a length of firewood from the hearth and swung it hard, catching Boone across the back. He went down hard, cursing and spitting, clutching his side. Silence crashed down, sudden and complete. Boone groaned on the floor, glaring up at them with hate burning in his eyes. Clay lay dazed, blood trickling from his temple where Joseph's fist had found him. Cora stood over them, the rifle steady in her hands. "You'll leave this ranch," she said, her voice low and deadly calm. "You'll leave this county. And if I ever see you again, there won't be warnings." Boone's mouth twisted into a sneer, but he said nothing. Joseph hauled Clay to his feet, shoving him toward the door. Boone staggered after them, casting one last venomous look over his shoulder. They disappeared into the night, swallowed by the dark. The sisters sagged against each other, the adrenaline leaching away, leaving only exhaustion and trembling relief in its place. Joseph stood apart, his hat in his hands, his eyes lowered. "I'm sorry," he said, voice rough with shame. "I should have spoken sooner." Cora crossed the room, reaching out to touch his arm lightly. "You spoke when it mattered," she said. Outside, the blood moon began to sink, its crimson light fading into the deep blue of approaching dawn. The house bore scars now, the broken door, the scuffed floors, the bloodied handprints smearing the walls, but it still stood. And so did they. Rachel picked up the fallen shotgun, setting it carefully on the table. She looked at Joseph, studying the hard lines of his face, the quiet in his eyes. "We'll need to fix the door," she said. Joseph smiled faintly, a tired, crooked thing. "I'll see to it," he said. The sisters moved through the wreckage, righting chairs, gathering broken dishes, piecing their world back together one small act at a time. Outside, the first birds began to sing, tentative and soft. The long night was over. But the true rebuilding, the true healing, was only just beginning. And somewhere in the spaces between heartbeats, between bruises and broken things, something new stirred, a fragile, stubborn hope that would not die. The days after the blood moon passed in a blur of hard work and harder choices. The sisters patched the door with scrap wood and nailed the shutters tight against the unpredictable winds. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the prairie grass outside made them straighten their backs and sharpen their ears. The ranch no longer felt like a home. It was a fortress, a line in the dirt that said no farther. Joseph stayed, though no words were spoken to invite him. He moved through the days like a man working off a debt that could never truly be repaid. He repaired the stable roof where a storm had torn loose the shingles. He dug a new fence line by the south pasture, hands blistering and bleeding without complaint. He ate meals quietly, sitting a respectful distance from the hearth, a man who knew he had been given a second chance and dared not ask for more. Trust grew not in great leaps but in small, stubborn inches. It lived in the way Rachel left a cup of coffee on the rail where Joseph worked without speaking. It lived in the way Maybelle hummed while gathering eggs, her voice trembling back to life like a spring thaw. It lived in the way Cora stopped bracing herself every time a man's boots crossed the threshold. The land itself seemed to lean closer, watching, waiting. The sky stayed low and heavy, clouds dragging their bellies across the hills, whispering of rain that never quite came. The cattle grew restless. The horses spooked at shadows. Willow Creek held its breath. The danger had not passed with Boone and Clay's retreat. Everyone knew it. Men like them did not take humiliation kindly. Their pride would fester like a wound, and they would return, meaner and more desperate. The sisters needed allies, and they needed them fast. One evening, after supper, Cora unfolded a tattered map across the kitchen table. Her finger traced the trails that spiderwebbed from the ranch toward the town. They would need the town's help, or at least its silence. Word traveled fast in a place like this, and isolation could turn deadly if neighbors closed their doors. Rachel leaned over the map, studying it with narrowed eyes. "We'll need to ride out. Talk to the McGraws, the DeVises. Maybe even old Tanner down by the river bend." "Won't be easy," Maybelle said, voice small. "Folks don't like taking sides." "They'll have to," Cora said. "One way or another." Joseph spoke then, his voice low and certain. "I can ride to town. Talk to the blacksmith, the grocer. Men listen to me easier than they will to you." Cora's first instinct was to refuse. Pride rose hot and sharp in her throat. But she swallowed it down. This wasn't about pride. It was about survival. "All right," she said. "But you carry our name with you. You remember that." Joseph met her gaze, steady as an oak. "I will." The next morning dawned bleak and cold, a wind stirring the dust into long, thin ghosts that trailed across the plains. Joseph saddled his mare, packed light, and rode out without fanfare. The sisters spent the day mending fences, tending to the livestock, repairing the damages left behind by Boone and Clay's assault. Their bodies ached, their hands bled, but they moved with the grim determination of soldiers fortifying their last stronghold. At dusk, Rachel climbed to the ridge overlooking the ranch. She sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, staring out over the land that had cost them so much. Below, the house looked small and lonely against the vastness of the world. A single light burned in the kitchen window, a stubborn flame against the coming dark. She thought of her father, of his rough hands and steady voice. She thought of her mother, of songs sung by firelight, of promises that the land would provide if only they loved it enough. It was a cruel thing, how love and survival so often stood at odds. Footsteps crunched softly behind her. Rachel did not turn. She knew it was Cora. "You thinking about leaving?" Cora asked, her voice wrapped in the wind. Rachel shook her head. Thinking about staying. About what it's gonna cost. Cora lowered herself to the ground beside her, close but not touching. They sat in silence, watching the stars wink awake one by one. Whatever it costs, Cora said finally, it's worth it. This place, it's in our bones, Rachel. It's who we are. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, letting the truth of it settle into her. When they returned to the house, Maybelle had set out bread and cheese on the table, her face pale but determined. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the soft clink of plates. Late into the night, the sound of hooves shattered the stillness. The sisters jumped to their feet, hearts pounding. Joseph rode into the yard, dust and sweat streaking his face. His horse blew hard, sides heaving. "They're coming," he said, swinging down from the saddle. "Boone, Clay, and a few others. Word is they're planning to burn the place down if they can't take it." Cora felt the world tilt and right itself around those words. There was no more hoping for peace, only preparing for war. Joseph dropped a worn satchel on the table. Inside were bullets, fresh powder, nails, rope. "I talked to the blacksmith," he said. "And the Devises. They'll come. Tanner too. They're tired of Boone's bullying." "How long?" Rachel asked. Joseph wiped a hand across his mouth. 2 days, maybe 3. They're gathering in town first, drinking up their courage. Maybelle hugged herself, shivering despite the warmth of the fire. "We have to be ready," Cora said. "Ready for anything." The next 2 days were a blur of preparation. They fortified the house, boarded the windows, reinforced the doors. They dug shallow trenches around the barn and stacked barrels of water in case of fire. They moved the livestock into the southern pasture, away from the line of attack. Joseph taught them how to shoot better, correcting their stances with quiet patience. Rachel caught him once, watching Cora with something almost like reverence in his eyes. She said nothing. There were bigger battles to fight. The neighbors trickled in as promised. Old Tanner, with his creaky knees and sharp eyes. The Davis boys, strong and stubborn. The blacksmith, a giant of a man with hands like iron vices and a voice that could shake the rafters. They came not out of love for the Langston sisters, but out of hatred for what Boone represented. Lawlessness, cruelty, the end of all they had worked to build on the unforgiving land. On the eve of the coming storm, the ranch pulsed with a strange, electric energy. Men checked rifles and sharpened knives. Horses shifted restlessly in their pens. Cora stood by the porch, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. Joseph approached, his hat in his hands. "You should know," he said quietly, "when this is over, I ain't got nowhere else to be. Nowhere I'd rather be." Cora turned to him, the wind tugging loose strands of her hair across her face. She saw him clearly for the first time. Not just the man who stayed, but the man who chose them when no one else would. "You got a place here," she said. Joseph smiled, a small, fierce thing, and stepped back into the shadows without asking for more. Inside, Maybelle sang softly under her breath, an old lullaby their mother had loved. Her voice wavered but did not break. Rachel cleaned her rifle, each swipe of the cloth steady, sure. The Langston sisters were no longer lambs. They were wolves now, too. The night grew deep and dark around them, the stars crowding close, as if the heavens themselves bent low to bear witness to what was coming. The gathering storm was not a thing of weather. It was a thing of men, and pride, and blood. And the Langstons, battered but unbroken, stood ready to meet it head-on. The night before the reckoning, Willow Creek Ranch held its breath. The prairie was a wide, dark ocean, the land stretching outward under a sky so heavy with stars it seemed it might collapse under its own weight. The house stood at the center of it all, a battered ship lashed together by hope and iron will, its windows glowing with soft lamplight. Inside, the Langston sisters prepared not for survival, but for victory. Cora stood at the kitchen table, spreading cartridges across a faded oilcloth. Her hands moved with the calm certainty of a woman who had already counted the cost and accepted it. She wore her father's old belt slung low on her hips, a revolver snug against her thigh. Her hair was pulled back in a rough knot, strands falling loose around her face, but she left them. Tonight was not a night for vanity. Tonight was for standing her ground. Maybelle moved quietly, setting water to boil, preparing bandages, her slender hands trembling just slightly as she worked. She had braided her hair into 2 tight plaits, practical and out of the way. Her eyes, soft and wide, held no illusions. She knew what morning would bring. Still, she hummed under her breath, an old song about brave men and braver women, her voice stitching courage into the worn fabric of the house. Rachel leaned against the doorframe, polishing the barrel of her rifle until it gleamed like a shard of moonlight. She had always been the fighter, the one with fire in her blood, but tonight she was something more. Her anger had been honed into a blade, sharp and clean. She was ready. She had been ready since the first day Boone Reddick set his sights on their land like a wolf scenting blood. Joseph moved among them like a silent promise. He checked the locks on the windows, the nails hammered into the door frames, the barrels of water set out to douse any fire. He said little, but his presence filled the house with a quiet strength. He belonged here now, not as a protector, not as a hired hand, but as something more elemental, a piece of the foundation, a stone laid with care and conviction. Dawn crawled over the horizon with a sickly, pale light. Fog coiled low over the ground, thick and ghostly. The gathered men, Tanner, the Davis boys, the blacksmith and a few others, took their places with grim determination. They knew they were outnumbered, knew that Boone and Clay would not come alone. They came anyway. From the ridge, dust rose in the distance, a scar against the silvered grass. Riders. At least a dozen, maybe more. The Langston sisters stood together on the porch, rifles in hand, eyes fixed on the oncoming storm. Boone led the charge, his horse frothing at the mouth, his face twisted in a grin that held no joy. Clay rode at his side, a shotgun slung across his saddle, his eyes bloodshot and wild. Behind them, men howled and whooped, the sound carrying across the open land like the call of hungry wolves. Cora stepped forward, her boots firm on the wood. She raised her rifle and fired once into the air. The crack split the morning like a thunderclap. The riders slowed, uncertainty rippling through their ranks. "This is our land," Cora called, her voice steady and clear. "Turn back now, and you leave with your lives." Boone laughed, a sound raw and broken. "This land ain't yours, girl. It never was. You think you can hold it with a handful of dirt farmers and a pretty smile." Behind her, Maybelle and Rachel shifted their stances, rifles ready, faces hard. Joseph stood at the foot of the steps, a silent sentinel. Boone spurred his horse forward, shouting for the others to follow. The first shots rang out, ripping through the fragile stillness. Bullets whined past like angry bees, splintering wood, kicking up dust. The defenders returned fire, methodical and unyielding. Men screamed and horses shrieked, the air filling with the sharp tang of gunpowder and blood. Tanner took a bullet to the shoulder but stayed upright, his rifle barking like a war drum. The Davis boys moved together, a wall of stubborn defiance. The blacksmith wielded a shotgun with terrifying precision, dropping 2 men before they even reached the fence line. Cora fought with the ruthless clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose. She picked her shots carefully, dropping Boone's lead man with a single round through the chest. She saw Boone's grin falter, saw doubt flicker in his eyes. Maybelle stayed near the house, her aim shaky but improving with every shot. She wasn't built for violence, but she fought anyway, for the horses she had sung to, for the field she had tended, for the family that had already lost too much. Rachel moved like a force of nature, her rifle slung over her back when the fight grew too close, a pistol in each hand. She fought not with rage but with purpose, her movements efficient, her face set like stone. Joseph fought at her side, back to back, a dance of survival choreographed by instinct and trust. He moved to shield her when a shot went wide, and she covered him when he stumbled, their bond solidifying in the crucible of battle. The tide turned slowly, painfully. Boone's men faltered as one after another fell. Fear crept into their ranks, a cold poison. Boone roared at them to stand, to fight, but even he could see it slipping away. Clay made a desperate push toward the house, shotgun raised. Maybelle froze, her rifle empty, her hands fumbling for more ammunition. Joseph saw it first. He sprinted toward her, tackling her to the ground just as the shotgun roared. The blast ripped through the doorframe, sending splinters flying. Rachel whirled and fired, hitting Clay in the leg. He went down hard, cursing and crawling through the dirt. Boone shouted something incoherent and charged, his horse foaming at the mouth. Cora stood firm. She raised her rifle, aimed for Boone's chest, and fired. The shot hit true. Boone slid from the saddle, crumpling to the ground in a cloud of dust. His horse reared and bolted, the others scattering. Silence fell, broken only by the ragged breathing of the wounded and the low moans of the dying. Cora lowered her rifle slowly, her hands trembling now that it was over. She looked around the battlefield that had once been her front yard and felt an ache deeper than any wound. The surviving attackers fled, riding hard for the hills, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The Langston Ranch still stood, battered, bloodied, but standing. Joseph helped Maybelle to her feet, brushing dust from her dress with gentle hands. She smiled at him, a small, grateful thing that shone brighter than the rising sun. Rachel moved among the wounded, checking who could be saved. She found Clay, bleeding and cursing, and for a moment, she simply stared at him. She thought of all the fear he had caused, all the hurt he had tried to sow. Then she turned away, leaving him to the justice of the law or the mercy of the plains. Tanner clapped Cora on the back, wincing from his wound. "You're tougher than you look," he said with a crooked grin. Cora smiled back, a real smile, the first in what felt like a lifetime. They buried the dead at sunrise, the earth drinking in the blood of the fallen. No speeches were given. None were needed. The neighbors stayed to help patch the house, to mend the fences, to drive the surviving cattle back into the pastures. Bonds were reforged in blood and fire, stronger than any words could ever make them. When the work was done and the dust finally settled, the Langston sisters stood together on the porch, looking out over their battered but unbroken land. Joseph stood beside them, his hat in his hands. Cora turned to him, her heart full and trembling. "You don't have to stay," she said. Joseph looked at her, really looked at her, and shook his head slowly. "I ain't got nowhere else I'd rather be," he said. Cora stepped closer, reaching out to take his rough, calloused hand in hers. He squeezed back, firm and steady. Rachel leaned her head against Maybelle's shoulder, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they laughed, a soft, startled sound, full of relief and wonder. The prairie wind lifted around them, warm and sweet, carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh earth. The sun climbed higher, gilding the land in gold. The Langston sisters had fought for their home, for their future, and they had won. The ranch would heal. The land would heal. And so would they. Hope, once a fragile thing trembling in the dark, now bloomed bold and bright in their chests. Out there beyond the horizon, trouble would always come, storms would always gather. But here, in this moment, they had peace. They had each other. They had a future they had carved out with blood and love and fierce, stubborn will. And they would hold it, come what may. Because Willow Creek was theirs, and it always would be.